Welcome everyone, our panelists, everyone joining in through YouTube, and of course those joining in from the UN NGO CSW platform to our event today. I'm Iysha, Project Coordinator and Research Fellow here at the Dialogue Society, and I'll be host for our event. I do require a little patience from you, however, as I'm losing my voice, but I've been told by my colleagues that I can be heard, so hopefully I won't cause much disruption and we can have an enjoyable event all together. We're delighted to be part of the parallel event series this year and be able to present a summary of our work that my colleagues have been working on women of faith, which was initially a panel series that then kind of transpired and become part of a policy paper. And the panels were conducted late last year, and of course, we'll be presenting that here as well. So for those of you who are perhaps hearing our organization for the first time, I'd kind of like to briefly introduce us and some of the work we do, and then pass on to our speakers who can inform you more of the work that they presented and worked on regarding the panel series. So we're the Dialogue Society, a registered charity which has been operating throughout the UK for over 20 years now, with the aim of advancing social cohesion by connecting communities, empowering people to engage and contribute to the development of ideas on dialogue. We do this through a variety of work, discussion forums, courses, some publications, which we're here to discuss as well today, to things like picnics and trips and courses and art. So whatever really is an opportunity to kind of go across boundaries of religion, culture, social class, and so on, to engage in dialogue. Although we were founded by British Muslims, our organization isn't religious or ethnic per se, and our projects kind of go on a vast variety of areas and touch upon them, whether it's kind of racial equality, gender equality, which we're here to discuss today, extremism or loneliness. We kind of work in a lot of different fields and a lot of different types of projects engaging with individuals at all levels of society. If you'd like to kind of be informed about our work or projects, please do feel free to check through either our kind of social media, our website, or feel free to get in contact with us through email, which I can share in the chat section as well. So on the topic of the empowerment of women in faith, as I mentioned, we had a panel series and in which we discussed barriers and challenges which women of faith may encounter in three key areas, that is community, public service, and the media. Our policy paper then went on to review the panel discussions and formulated or brought together, or kind of brought to light perhaps, policy recommendations that were made in those panels. And of course, if you wish to access this policy paper as well, you can do through the publication section of our website. It's titled A UK Analysis, Empowering Women of Faith in the Community, Public Service and Media. And we hope that this event will be one of several dialogues contributing to somehow the empowerment or betterment of the position of women of faith in various elements of society, and today more specifically the community, public service and media, which we're here to discuss. If throughout the kind of discussion you have any questions, do feel free to type them in the Q&A section on Zoom if you're joining us through Zoom, or in the YouTube chat section if you're joining through YouTube as well. And I'll hopefully be able to channel them into the 15-minute Q&A section that we have at the end. So without further delay, I'd like to pass the microphone to my colleague Hannah. She'll be able to give the background story of the panel series, which was her project over the last year, and the policy paper, hopefully mentioning some of the work we've done before as well. Hannah Lowe is a graduate of geography from Royal Holloway, University of London. Her specific areas or interests are in the areas of politics, human rights, and community development. She's a project coordinator here at the Dialogue Society and communications assistant for Every Life International. Hannah, without further ado, I'll pass the mic to you, and I can tell that my voice is beginning to struggle, so that was just in time.
Thank you so much, Iysha. Thank you for that introduction. So yeah, my name's Hannah, and good afternoon to everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background to this policy paper and the panel series as a whole that it was based upon. So last year, Dialogue Society presented a policy paper that we had written on women's empowerment, having hosted a panel series that explored the challenges women face throughout careers in politics, business, and academia. This policy paper reviewed issues raised during panel discussions and formulated policy recommendations. It aimed to highlight issues of gender equality and contribute to dialogue surrounding the pressures that women, and particularly those in positions of leadership, continue to face throughout their career progression. Wanting to expand on this work and explore further the nuances within issues of gender equality, we decided to host a panel series focusing specifically on women of faith, aiming to highlight the experiences, challenges, and contributions of women from different faith backgrounds in varying spheres of society, whilst also extending our gaze to examine the perceptions of women from all faiths and none in the public realm and media. This panel series extends the Dialogue Society's existing work on gender equality more broadly to focus on a particular, often overlooked group of women. The first panel on women of faith in community explored the different approaches, experiences, and challenges women from different faith backgrounds encounter in their involvement and integration into the local community. In particular, women of faith's role in creating social networks and maintaining cohesive communities were explored. This panel tackled questions about the role of women working alongside their own and other faith groups to benefit their wider community, and how women of faith, particularly those in leadership, are perceived by their own faith groups and the wider community. The second panel on women of faith in public service featured a diverse group of panelists from different areas of public service, all in conversation around the experiences of women from faith backgrounds working within public services. The discussion aimed to explore how the roles and expectations within public services interact within women's personal faiths and faith-based identities, particularly in often male-dominated working environments. Then the third and final panel featured panelists in conversation around the experiences of women from different faith backgrounds working in the media, extending discussions from previous panels to explore the narratives around women of faith that exist within the media. Indeed, the social climate of the UK is heavily affected by the predominant media stories that surround certain groups, and this includes women from faith backgrounds. This panel discussion therefore explored how women of faith are portrayed in the media and how far this impacts their role in local communities and their workplaces. It also explored the underlying narratives that impact how women of faith are seen within society and how this impacts ongoing dialogue between women of faith and those around them. The Dialogue Society have now written a policy paper named Empowerment of Women of Faith in the Community, Public Service and Media, that continues the discussions that took place during these panels by highlighting the findings of each panel and expanding on issues raised. This paper begins with a literature review, exploring topics covered during discussions and contextualizing these arguments within academic literature. The paper then continues with policy recommendations that builds on findings from our panel discussions to suggest changes and areas of improvement that would benefit women of faith within the community, public service, and in the media. This paper aims not just to cover the misrepresentation, discrimination, and the challenges faced by women of faith, but also to create solutions for them. It is our hope, therefore, that this will further conversations around the role of women of faith within society and contribute to positive changes that address the issues and challenges that women of faith face within their local communities, their workplaces, and in the way they are represented in the media. So lastly, I'd like to acknowledge each of our panelists for their valuable insights and their contributions during discussions. I'd like to acknowledge Iysha, Arun, and Lindsay Simmons for their contributions towards and support of the paper, And lastly, the Executive Director, Sadiq Sinha, and Jem Erbil, the Academic Director of Dialogue Society, for supporting the research and production of this publication. So thank you very much for listening. I'll pass back to Iysha.
Thank you, Hannah, for kind of summarising the panel series and how the policy paper came to be once again. And thank you for the kind of short shout out there at the end. I also want to thank Neva once again, who's our kind of GCSE student interning for one of the kind of government awards, who interned with us at the Dialogue Society and is currently working on our social medias as we go through the event. So Neva, thank you once again for kind of supporting us and being part of this as well. But without further ado, I'd now like to pass the panel on to our first speaker from the panel series, Women of Faith in Community. I'd like to pass the microphone on to Dr. Lindsey Simmons. Lindsay is a research officer at the Religion of Global Society Department at LSE. Her particular remit is in research into women of faith and peace building. She received her PhD from LSE's Department of Gender in January 2020, titled Generating Piety Agency in the Lives of British Orthodox Women. Lindsay, thank you for being here with us today. We look forward to hearing your contributions to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Iysha. Can you just give me a thumbs up that you can hear me? Okay, great. Okay, I'm just going to start my presentation here. So I'm going to try and share a screen. I will do my best. Okay, please also give me a thumbs up if that's coming up. Thank you. And then I will just play and I hope you'll be able to see it. Okay, does that work? Perfect. Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me back. It's fantastic to be part of this panel, and I really applaud and I'm very grateful for your report. So thank you for that. So my movement here today is to speak about women of faith in the community and the findings from the panel and your literature review, etc. I'm just going to really give a very basic outline as to what we discussed at the panel, and I've set that up under certain headings and titles just for clarity. These are, of course, are not comprehensive. There are lots of other very important and relevant issues about women of faith in the community here in the UK, but I hope it's the beginning and generation of a conversation about these issues. First, sensible and, in my humble opinion, of course, being a researcher, extremely important part of your policy suggestions was research. Encourage more scholarly research into religious women's lives. And I think that can be done in several different ways. The suggestions that were spoken about and that have been discussed are to mentor female academics, especially in their early careers. And I've added here to fund scholarship opportunities, and that includes students, early career academics, and also departments. When I studied my master's and my PhD at the Department of Gender, there are many modules that one can take: gender theory, gender in the media, gender in development, but there was no gender and religion. So these are spaces that are real opportunities for this kind of encouragement, scholarly encouragement and funding. And lastly, as we're doing here today, is to create spaces for academic debate. So that might include something like this, or of course, academic seminars, conferences, and in particular, I think special edition journals are an ideal way to think about and to highlight some of the issues of religious women's lives. Okay, I'm trying to go to the next slide, but it doesn't want to let me. Hold on one moment, please. Here we go. Okay, the second issue I want to think about is inclusivity. This is one of my favorite photos, and as you can imagine, given the work that I do, I have quite a lot of them. This one was taken in Gibraltar, And I particularly like it because it says at the bottom, Gibraltar, an example to the world. Now, of course, I have to say that all of these gentlemen are working extremely hard in terms of interfaith relations and peace building, and they're all doing a very good job of it. But of course, the glaring and obvious absence here are women. So the second suggestion that comes out from the panel and from your report is the concept of inclusivity. Okay, there is a glaring gap here where there should be, in my humble opinion, women's leadership as religious leaders represented, especially if one uses this catchphrase and example to the world. Okay. So I think that I have made a point in terms of pictures, and I feel that they really often speak much better than words, but I will nevertheless read this. So women as leaders within religious communities. So first of all, as represented by that previous picture, we ask the women to be representative of their religious communities rather than just asking the men. And that has a problematic aspect to it, which is often the men have nomenclature that enables them to be recognizable leaders and authorities within their own religious communities. So I want to think about the nomenclature a lot. And I wrote a blog, which you, Hannah, noted in your report, that I will mention a little later, about this concept of making religious women invisible through nomenclature. And an example of this, of course, is the word rabbi. Certainly here in the UK, that at the moment means exclusively men. I think we need to think about that and work on it. That is not necessarily true in Israel or in the States, but in the UK, where there is a conservative with a small c religious community, that is specifically used for men. This is an example of inclusivity. Where I think it works very well. This is the recent conference by the CCJ, the Council of Christians and Jews, very recent. And at the top, you can see that it says the Rabbi and Clergy Conference. Now, it seems quite strange then that Orthodox Jewish women would be included under the word clergy rather than rabbis. But given that the nomenclature is so problematic, this is an example where people get around that in order to be inclusive. In addition to that, they invited Catherine Sonderegger, who herself obviously is a woman, to speak as the keynote speaker at the conference, but that's another story. Okay. Thirdly, the recognition of women of faith's work. I've written this as name it, give it value and appreciation, and that means all the work. As I recall, in a conversation after one of the panels, one of the questions asked was about how things happen in events, and the example of a church, tea was brought, and one of the male leaders of that community said, and almost magically, all the food appeared. And this concept of almost magically, as if there was no hard work involved, and this idea of not appreciating, not giving value to all types of work done by women of faith in community, I think is a major problem. It is not only a problem, clearly, for women of faith, but unpaid labor in general. We're not here to talk about that, but I want to ensure that I'm talking about all types of work. So from grassroots, from voluntary work to paid work, even up to policy making, all has material and transformational relevance. And that is true within one's community as a woman of faith, within the intra-faith community. So for example, for me, that would be within the Orthodox Jewish community, and then also within the intra-faith, so the Orthodox community, when one has events with other non-Orthodox communities, the interfaith community, so between the Jewish community, Muslim community, Christian community, and communities of no faith, and of course within wider society in general. And fourthly, and for me, I think this is almost the most important, this move from homogeneity, in other words, all women of faith look like this, or behave like this, or think like this, to heterogeneity, where there is an abundance, an eclectic variety of the way in which people live their lives. So women in or of faith communities are housewives, mothers and grandmothers. They are lawyers and accountants and doctors. They are academics and civil servants and policymakers. And all of them are representative of women in faith communities. And I've just brought some examples here. So on the left, we have Dina Kishawi, who is a doctor, and she actually mentors other Muslim women doctors in order to encourage them to take up medicine in the way she has. And on the right, there is a woman called Rakhia. She's a very unusual woman. She's become quite famous, actually, in the media, on YouTube and so on. She's a woman from the Orthodox Hasidic community, so it's very unusual that she would then take up a job as a judge. And so these are also women of faith. So too are these women. The woman on the left is a generic grandmother, and on the right, a generic mother, okay? One from the Orthodox Jewish community and one from the Muslim community. Each of them women of faith, okay? So these are women of faith, these are women of faith, okay. I want to talk about the recognition of women's faith leadership also in the interfaith and peace building community. So although I've mentioned this as part of the recognition of what women of faith do, I want to also highlight it specifically. This on the right is from that blog that I wrote for the LSE that Hannah, you did quote. Given that interfaith work promotes collaboration, human connection and transformation, I'm optimistic that Orthodox Jewish women have found and will continue to find a home within the interfaith community that not only allows them to flourish as religious leaders, but encourages them to do so. And in so doing, I'm hopeful that the male rabbis of the British Orthodox Jewish communities themselves involved in interfaith work might be transformed by it to view their own religious power structures through a new lens. I'm also hopeful that this work may encourage them to take the imaginative leap to appreciate what Orthodox women have to offer their communities as religious leaders, implicit in an appropriate and well-deserved nomenclature. So that's what I mentioned earlier, and this is where I wrote about it. And I put it here because it is an interesting, I think, a fascinating part of certainly my life and Orthodox Jewish women's lives, is that they might take positions of authority and leadership outside their own community, because within their own community, it is very difficult. Here I've got some pictures. So on the left, we have a woman called Huda Abu al-Ruk. She is actually the director of ALMEP, the Alliance for Middle East Peace. That is me on the right. I'm so sorry. And that is very recently. And I'm working on women of faith and peace building. And my research is particularized at the moment to the Israel-Palestine region. And we met a couple of weeks ago, and this is us at a cafe in a place called Beit Jala. On the right is a picture of myself and Julie Siddiqui, who was a panel member of the Women of Faith Communities discussion. And this was something we did together last year. But the Sisters Not Strangers poster, I feel, is a very important one, again, in terms of enabling women of faith to see where their options are within their own communities and external to them, and specifically in terms of collaboration with other women of faith. And lastly, and this really is, I think, an overall outcome in terms of policy, which is make women of faith visible. And I think this is probably relevant to the other speakers as well. So women of faith as leaders within their own communities, so ensure they're represented as learned or educated, as authoritative and as actively participatory in ritual. So I have pictures here. Some of these women may be familiar to you. This is Dina Nyman, who is a medical ethicist, lives in the United States. This is Tamar Ross, Professor Tamar Ross, who, although in her picture looks like a very genteel woman, is considered quite heretical in some of the Orthodox circles, certainly by some of the male authorities. This is Rabbanit Chana Henkin, who opened and began a course for Jewish women that is equivalent, the first one that is equivalent to male ordination. And here is Dina, and she lives in Israel, and Tamara Ross lives in Israel also. And this is Dina Brower, who is from the UK. She was the first, she's originally from Italy, but lived here in the UK. And she's the first woman in the UK to achieve rabbinic ordination through a program in the States. She, however, has subsequently moved to the States, given there was no position for her in the Orthodox community here. I think it is interesting to note 3 things. One, all of these women are pictured with books behind them. I note it specifically, and this sense of authority and education within their own religious communities is made visible through both their being in the pictures, but also the context of those pictures. Secondly, I want to note that these women, none of them live in the UK. And I again emphasize the fact that within the UK, this is very difficult. And lastly, I just want to mention this woman on the left, again, a generic woman, but she is reading the scroll of Esther on the very recent festival of Purim, the Feast of Lots. And in the UK, there are several women's readings of the scroll, and the oldest one is 23 years old this year. So this is happening in the UK. Lastly, this was within their own faiths, and this is within general society. So when people ask the questions about women of faith and think about what is going on with who they are and what they do, I think that these are the questions that came up in the panel, that are again mentioned in the policy paper, that are the central questions to ensure that women of faith are represented properly. Number 1, who are the clergy? So be inclusive and not exclusive. Okay, so that's within one's own religious faith community. 2, what is women's community work? Okay, so don't be prescriptive, be descriptive, right? Women's community work varies significantly from community to community, from woman to woman, and from country to country. And who are the women of faith? Okay, what do they look like? What do they do? Are they only housewives or grandmothers? And are they described, as I have just said, as only? Right? That's incredibly problematic language, okay? Are they only doctors and accountants? Are they, right? So this language has to be extremely carefully and sensitively used. But in general, the question is, are people expansive and able to understand that women of faith offer many different options of life, or are they reductive and presume a certain way of life for women of faith? Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lindsay, for summarizing the work that you're doing, both kind of within your own community and in the interfaith community, and specifically in research, as you said, that's where, as a researcher yourself, you and quite rightly think that more work needs to be done and more opportunities need to be put available. So thank you for kind of touching on the depth and variety of work that women, both within the Jewish community, intra, and then in interfaith communities as well, engage in and contribute from, as you said, whether that's something like cooking, whether that's something like researching. There is a variety, and each is equally valid and should be recognized and given worth to. So thank you very much for being here with us once again at one of our panels and contributing to our discussion. I will now go on to the second speaker of our panel, Dr. Anna Piela, who is a scholar of gender and Islam. Her areas of expertise include feminism in Islam, Eastern European Islam, as well as Islam in popular culture and digital media. So Anna, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here with us again.
And thank you so much for having me. Thank you for this really important work. It is vital that we keep saying all these things, that we keep highlighting them, and that this is the only way. This is the only way. The sorry state of affairs that we see in the UK, but also in the West more widely, in the respect in this respect can be changed, improved. So I've got a brief presentation. So I'm just going to try to share my screen. And so I'm going to give a summary of the panel that happened on the 9th of December 2021. I was one of the 4 panelists. So here I would like to first of all sort of acknowledge them and celebrate them. The first panelist was Chinny McDonald, head of community fundraising and public engagement at Christian Aid. I was the second panelist. The third panelist was Rahina Harilal, psychologist, coach, and management consultant. And the final panelist was Manpreet Kaur Sachdeva, output producer at Sky News. I'm talking, but really I'm trying to represent what all these fantastic women who came to speak on the panel said. But before I actually move on to the summary, I want to give a little bit of a context and my diagnosis. So my diagnosis, which is not very original, but I'm still going to say it because it must be said, is that sexism and white supremacy in major and other local media organizations they are rife. Some sort of statistics. British journalism industry is 94% white, 86% university educated, and 55% male. So the UK journalism is not really doing that great on diversity, but women seem to be almost there in terms of numbers. But we're talking about women of faith. Anecdotal. Fewer women of faith will be represented proportionately in that 45% group of women. As far as the, racial and religious diversity, only 0.4% of British journalists, 0.4% of British journalists are Muslim, and only 0.2% are Black, whereas 5% of the UK population is Muslim and 3% is Black. So here we've got this obvious disproportion, and some people would say underrepresentation. I would say this is the overrepresentation of white people and people from the majority society. They are overrepresented, and they're sort of they are the driving force of this this disproportion. So that's the question of access. But even for those women who get into journalism, they are paid significantly less. They're male journalists, and so there's an enduring. That's one thing that can be off-putting for women and women of faith more specifically. From joining the profession. Advancement is also stunted for women. Women generally after between 6 and 10 years of being in the profession, almost half of them are still rank and file. They're lower paid. They have less power in the organization in terms of who sets the agenda. And only, sorry, this is a wrong number. I meant to change it. 36% of men are in that situation. 64% of men move on from that rank and file sort of pay brackets into the higher one. So men also advance much faster to better positions than women. And so this sort of context underpins what I see as two underrated problems of underrepresentation and misrepresentation. All the panelists on that 9th of December panel were talking about both things, and also they made the link. We all have made the link between the two problems. So if women of faith are underrepresented in those power structures within media organizations that produce content, very likely that the representation of women of faith will be skewed, will be prejudiced, and instead of informing informing society about women of faith's perspectives and experiences, society will be misinformed. Those women will be misrepresented. And so let's have a look at some findings that the panelists kind of brought to us. So Jenny MacDonald was talking about how women of faith are represented, and she sort of she reflected that a lot of the time women of faith who we see on the screens, perhaps are received or perceived as representing the entirety of their gender. But I would also add that proviso that it would usually be white women of faith and mostly Christian. So two sort of majority parameters of the British society. So what I'm driving at is, these white women of faith, if they get to be represented, they are usually represented as likable, ordinary, fun, spiritual, and may I also add women with authority. So, occasionally there will be an article or news segment about a female bishop, about a female member of the clergy, and they are, even though the representation of those women is still gendered, in that there is an too big focus, I would say, on things like the family, what she likes to wear. But still, this is, we could say overall, this kind of representation is generally pretty positive. Whereas in contrast, another example of that was white women who practice yoga. In Rahina Harilal's example, she was talking about how the practice of yoga has been hijacked in the media. And so whenever we see something to do with yoga in the media, it will be women, white women who sort of who are engaging in the practice, but they don't really follow all the sort of spiritual prescriptions that come with yoga for Buddhists. And so the representation of Buddhism in the media and Buddhist women is overall also quite positive and friendly. But Rahina made a point that that is not always sort of representative of the reality on the ground. She mentioned that women are very often erased or not given access to monastic orders in Buddhism. So there is a sort of very essentialist, homogeneous presentation of Buddhism as well. In contrast, we have representations of Black and brown women, and they might be Black Christian women or Muslim women. But they are, those representations are either insufficient in terms of, they're just not there. They're very rarely seen on screen, or when we read articles, broadsheet articles online, there's usually a little picture, and so very rarely do we see a picture of a female journalist that's not white. And so those representations of women, minority women of faith, will be sort of, generally very prejudiced, because Black women are typically represented as angry, but also over-sexualized, whereas Muslim women, and here comes an example from my own representations of Muslim women in the UK who wear the niqab. And those representations are unsurprisingly very, very negative. Those women are presented either as voiceless and implicitly voiceless, because there are so many articles, there's so much media output about the niqab, where women who wear the niqab are not consulted. They're not asked to speak about their experiences. Instead, we have a whole range of experts, Muslim and not Muslim, male, who who have an opinion on the niqab, and they feel that that opinion is vital and central, where in fact it is not. But they are given that platform. Women who wear the niqab recently, especially in the recent couple of years, have been portrayed as extremists. Whenever there's an article or media segment about the so-called extremist Islam, the illustrations, the images that are used to sort of illustrate the point that the journalist is making will very often be women who wear the niqab. So yeah, lack of representation leads to misrepresentation. Now, we had on the panel one member of the panel who kind of was a notable example. So Manpreet Kaur Sachdeva is this notable exception. She is a producer at Sky News, and she can provide expert knowledge, in the newsroom on Sikh-related issues, also on minority-related issues. She is there. So another producer can consult her in order to avoid making mistakes, to make the content more culturally sensitive. And so, it is an obvious conclusion that more women like Manpreet are needed, not just in those rank and file positions, but also in top positions in media organizations, to just change that white and middle class man skew. So there was a remarkable sort of consistency, I would say, even though the case studies were very different, but there was a consistency in how those panelists, how they focused on the issues of white supremacy and underrepresentation in the profession. So yeah, on the one hand, we have these white women, especially when Christian or Buddhist, whose representations are generally positive, non-threatening, versus all other women, minority women, Black women, women of faiths other than Christianity, who are racialized and as non-white, and they lack representation. And media is one of the key agents of socialization. And so changing this is particularly important for ethnic minority people, especially in the young generation. They need to see people like them represented in the media positively. But it is also important for the white majority people, white majority young people, to see and hear voices, talents, and resilience of women of faith, of different backgrounds. Seeing is, after all, necessary for believing, acknowledging, and embracing, at least in the day-to-day life. And thank you very much for your attention. This is all from me.
Thank you very much, Anna, for engaging in the discussion and bringing kind of a summary of our gender panel that we had, bringing in, of course, the perspectives of the media and your own research, which brought a richness, I think, of highlighting the intersectionality of gender as well with race and the other factors you mentioned. I kind of directly made two quotes from what you said. Lack of representation leads to misrepresentation, and media is a key agent of socialization. So those were two direct quotes that I took as highlights for myself. So thank you very much for being here with us again for the second panel. And hopefully we can engage in more discussion later on and in the Q&A, when, if of course people can channel. I should have reminded earlier, perhaps if our attendees either through Zoom or on YouTube want to comment their questions in, I can channel them through, and if there are any specific to any of our panelists, we can ask them specifically as well. We do have a third speaker who I've just been informed is running a little late, Councillor Rakhia Ismail. But I'll pass on to my colleague Shuying, who's here with us as well, who was going to discuss and will discuss the recommendations made in the policy paper based on the findings of our key speakers. And we've touched upon some of them in the discussion so far. Shuying is a master's student of social policy and social research at University College London, UCL. Since graduating from a degree in social anthropology, she's now narrowing her focus to the labour market and social mobility. Alongside her studies, she is a project member and research fellow here with us at the Dialogue Society. So Shuying, thank you for being here with us, and I'll pass the mic on to you now. Thank you.
Oh, hello, can you hear me? Hi, thank you, Iysha, and thank you for our speakers for your wonderful introduction and elaboration on this topic. So my name is Shuying, and I'm a research fellow and project member at the Dialogue Society. I'm very pleased to be here and to have participated in writing this report. Our policy paper titled "A UK Analysis: Empowering Women of Faith in the Community, Public Service and Media" aims to extend our gaze to the life and experience of women of faith by drawing on the issues raised in our three-part Women of Faith panel series and focusing on the barriers and challenges that they encounter in their everyday lives, particularly in the three areas of community, public service, and the media. Situated these issues in broader literature with special reference to discussions in the three areas and series regarding interfaith dialogue. This policy paper not only highlights the challenges and discriminations women of faith encounter within each area, but also proposed policy recommendations that seek to solve issues discussed in the panel series and benefit women of faith in the three specific areas as well as different dimensions in the whole society. These recommendations are based on the most obvious issues in the three areas mentioned in the panel discussion, with a focus on the underrepresentation and misrepresentation of women of faith and the intersectional discriminations they encounter in different social dimensions. For issues in the community sector, we discussed the urgent need to empower women of faith, as now we are faced with the problem that although women of faith have been actively involved in their communities and have made great achievements, their roles in the communities are often marginalized due to gender stereotypes, and there is also a lack of recognition of contributions of women of faith to community affairs. In the public service area, main issues discussed are intersectional discriminations against women of faith and the lack of representations of women of faith in employment in this area. Indeed, discussions in the panel series suggest in the public service area, women of faith are likely to encounter implicit discriminations against clothing with some religious significance, or microaggressions based on sexism that often go unreported. On the other hand, there is also a lack of women of faith working in the grassroots level, as well as in senior positions in the public service area, which leads to a lack of appropriate service provision to faith communities that may lead to other negative impacts and consequences. As for the media sphere, our focus lies on the misrepresentation of gender and religion in media content, as well as the discriminations that women of faith encounter in the media industry. To be more specific, women of faith are rarely represented in the media, while the existing representations and narratives of religion and gender in the media are often biased and problematic. This may lead to stereotypes that have a serious negative impact on public attitudes to women of faith, as media usually serves as the source of public perceptions towards religion, gender, as well as women of faith. With the above in mind, the recommendations in this policy paper echo our previous policy paper on women's empowerment, while highlighting solutions to issues in three areas. In terms of the community area, our recommendations center around empowering women of faith including help women of faith to get access to media platforms and provide women of faith with training schemes to help them speak up for themselves through the media, as well as using social media platforms to promote an environment that welcomes inclusive and friendly interfaith dialogue and encourage women of faith to raise up their own voice on such platforms. As for the public service area, our recommendations focus on creating an inclusive and welcoming environment at work, while highlighting equal opportunities in employment. In this case, our recommendations for this area highlight the necessity to facilitate continuous training programs that emphasize equal opportunities at work, clarify regulations addressing harassment and discriminations. Rules and regulations must be clarified and put in place that genuinely provide women of faith with due process and ensure the pursuit of legal entitlements does not carry undue career risk. In addition, it is also necessary for the government to take actions to enact Section 106 of the Equality Act. Also, policy reforms should be initiated to stop discriminations against clothing or other visible features that can be associated with an individual's faith or beliefs. For media area, our recommendations center around changing the biased and problematic representation of women of faith in media content. In this case, our recommendations focus on facilitating continuous training programs regarding religious literacy in media to promote more inclusive and bias-free representations of religion and gender, fact-checking and careful editorial process to avoid creating symbolic associations that are harmful for women of faith must be conducted. For example, it should not be allowed to use photos of women in niqabs to illustrate articles about terrorism. This policy paper is an attempt to identify issues within specific areas as well as issues which overlap across all the life and work experience of women of faith. Recommendations presented in this policy paper shows that while there are similarities in issues in different areas, each area has different approaches and methods to address issues women of faith encounter. In addition, we also call for further research that investigates the life and experience of women of faith. As each area is interconnected, changes and further understandings in one area might be catalysts for improvement in the society more general. This policy paper also highlights and explains in detail of what specific changes to procedures and existing policies should be made to address the issues in each area. If you are interested in this policy paper, you can find it in the public section of our website. And also, please subscribe to our mailing list as we will be sending this policy paper out via email. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shuying, for kind of highlighting and summarizing beautifully the work that kind of was put into the policy paper. And of course, you're a part of that. So thank you for both being a part of it and putting in, your hours and also presenting it here today. Councillor Rakhia hasn't been able to join. They've just kind of been informed that she's having some issues with her internet. So we can kind of go on to the Q&A section, and if she comes, we can hear from her as well. But I'd just like to remind those kind of either attending, if they want to ask questions, please do feel free to type them in the chat section. And of course, those watching us through YouTube as well can feel free to do so. I do have a couple of questions, and I had one which came through as a direct message to me. But just before I do, I would like to kind of open the Q&A to our panelists. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask another speaker? or about the work or the topic in general.
Well, I'm quite interested in the report actually, and what you, Iysha and Shuying and Hannah are planning to do with it, proliferation, continued research. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we were obviously like everyone else, the pandemic kind of put some strains on the work that we did. We wanted to engage in a kind of more public launch, but hopefully that's something we're looking forward to do, and also kind of networking with women's rights organizations throughout the UK and seeing if we can engage on those areas specifically and work on it. Hannah or Shuying, is there anything you kind of wanted to add to what we're doing with the work afterwards? It doesn't have to be. Dr. Simmonds, I actually had a message come through. I'm just trying to see if I can find the name, but one of my mentors, I'd say, who works in or researches in women's rights and feminism and Islam in the US, has just said that I think one of the ladies that you mentioned, Tamara Ross, is kind of someone that I believe is a doctor. Did you say she was
professor? Yes.
professor? And my friend said that she had just seen her yesterday. It was kind of shocking for her to then see her back on the screen, but it just shows how connected we all are.
So she wrote, I'll just speak about for a second since you mentioned her, she wrote a book, a really phenomenally transformative book for me personally, but for the I think for Orthodox Jewish women in general, called Expanding the Palace of Torah, and Torah not just being the, as it were, the sort of biblical text, but the life that Jews lead, Orthodox Jews, and specifically she writes about, she's a philosopher, and it's really about this concept of expansion, which she calls it expanding. And she has a whole philosophy stroke theology, really, it just as it happens, very much about I think what this research and your paper and these panels have done, which is again about moving from this idea of a restrictive life, of a limited life, of a prescribed life, to one of both religious flourishing, but also community flourishing, a personal flourishing, academic flourishing, whatever it is. And anyway, highly recommended.
Perfect, thank you. One of the questions that we've got come through from Heather Oxman, it goes so I'll just read it out. In Canada, in Quebec, Bill 21 strives to eliminate religious expression from the public service. I would like to know more about the equality bill mentioned by Shuying. How is it structured and what does it cover? I'm not an expert on the equality bill in the UK, but Shuying or anyone else who could perhaps comment on that, is there anything you'd like to answer?
Hi, can you hear me? So I think according to my understanding, I think the Section 106 of the Equality Act is a very simple bill. It just requires political parties to publish diversity data on candidates standing in elections to the House of Commons and devolved administrations. So I think this bill gives every voter, every common people a measurement to see if they have chose the right party to represent them, and gives them a way to measure which party has done a great job on representing the diverse society. and to see if the appeal for a more diverse and more equal society has achieved due to the work and progress made by the government. Yeah, so I think that's what I understand of the section 106.
Thank you, Shuying, for answering the question that came through. Another question that we've got is, would you have any advice for young women of faith who think they represent the whole community? Is that an aspiration they should have, or a burden? I felt a bit odd reading the question, because as reading it was saying that would be quite a burden, and then the question ended with burden. So I think that's my opinion. But does anyone else have any kind of comments or opinions on young women? And I think especially if you're from a faith background in which you are more visibly from that faith background. I know Muslim women who wear the hijab or niqab do also feel this pressure, and it's something that is voiced that is a very, very heavy burden. But does anyone have any comments on that?
Anna, were you going to say something? Sorry.
I mean, just loose reflections on that, but I think it's an upward slog in the sense that the structure is not very sort of welcoming for women of faith who might want to be journalists. So I would say, go for all the programs, all the opportunities, fellowships, internships that are offered, and even if they're labeled as diversity sort of programs, there are quite a lot of those in the United States, and sometimes it is considered that it is sort of something lesser, but I would say the structure promotes white people, males, middle-class people so much that there should not be any shame in going for opportunities that are somehow fenced off for minority women, for women of faith. And the second thing is, I think, participate in networks, because there are women who are, they're talented, they're super successful, and I think they might be more willing than your average sort of successful journalist to mentor, to provide advice, to kind of just act as role models in that sense. So I would say also reach out to women who you think might have shared experience with you, and they might turn out to be patrons, mentors, helpful kind of facilitators of your career, because anything that you can get in this hostile structure that does not favor you, is worth its weight in gold.
I would just add to that on a much less practical kind of avenue, is that you don't represent anyone but yourself. And however the burden feels and whatever you look like, in certain Orthodox Jewish communities, women who are married cover their hair like I do. Some wear wigs, some wear scarves, right? We're very recognizable, even if it's only within our own community. And so the way in which we behave, as you said, is a burden. Everything is pregnant with meaning suddenly, and so on and so forth. But I think you learn to become robust. You learn to become an individual within a community. And I think that, and I hope this doesn't sound like incredibly patronizing, so please hear it in the sense in which it is meant, is that we all have to some extent, work out what it is and who it is we represent but we don't represent everybody, even if we think we might, and we feel the burden of it, we don't. And I think that that's a liberating experience rather than a kind of a diminishing one.
Thank you very much. It's I think a shared experience that Jewish women and Muslim women do experience in society, and it is one that is frequently voiced internally. I think, at least from a Muslim perspective that I know, it's because you're represented either by the media or disrepresented, perhaps I should say, by politicians, by every other event that happens in the world in which everyone else is also part of, but you're just a little bit more visible. So it's a deeper question, perhaps, that we should or could another time have more time dedicated to. We have two other questions come through. One is from Hafsa Girdap, a PhD student at Stony Brook University, looking into gender and Islam. It's for Anna. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the changing discourse on misrepresented identities of women of faith, as to how that discourse perhaps changes over time? You're muted.
Yeah. I can only speak to my own work. You know, I always listen with fascination to other people's research on women of faith and their representations in the media, but you know, I really can sort of just speak with some degree of authority on what I have actually done, which is, you know, representations of Muslim women in the UK media initially, and later also shifted to the United States. But in the United Kingdom, I think one sort of context is colonialism, and the other one is neocolonialism. And so those are you know, shifting from the sort of original or earlier representations of women, Muslim women, who are, you know, as kind of silenced or especially oppressed by patriarchy, and that's shifted into this representation of the veiled Muslim woman as dangerous, threatening, kind of representing extremism and terrorist attacks, and I think those representations, I don't know that, you know, individual journalists are doing it consciously, but sort of looking from the macro level, I think that all sort of serves to support particular national policies. And so, for example, when in 2001, and its allies attacked Afghanistan, the idea of liberating the Afghan women was one of the driving forces of that, you know, of the justifications. Laura Bush went on the radio and said that, you know, fighting for gender equality is a kind of an American mission. And so this kind of cynical attack on Afghanistan was justified by pointing to, you know, in Afghanistan under the Taliban. However, the Taliban were, you know, they had been in power since 1997, and between 1997 and 2001, nobody was interested in what was going on there, how women were brutalized by the Taliban. It only became an issue when, you know, when the United States wanted to attack and find Osama bin Laden, and then, you know, steal the Afghan oil. So, you know, and that's when this idea of a, you know, silenced or oppressed Muslim woman was really important to sort of just drive it into the public imaginary. And then, you know, when especially following terrorist attacks, you know, in the West, when British policy was sort of tightened and started targeting Muslims, it was important to show not just the, you know, the dangerous terrorist Muslim man, but also suddenly, you know, this figure, this folk devil, was joined by the figure of a dangerous Muslim woman. And so it all serves a particular political goal. That's what I would say. That's how I see it. So maybe somebody else wants to sort of add something, but that's me in brief.
Yeah, I think a lot of the discourse, and this is just my general opinion, surrounding Muslim women and representation or misrepresentation is shaped around the events of 9/11 and the aftermath of that. And that goes for Muslim women and Muslim men as well. But hopefully, I mean, as you said, if those interested in this field want to be part of it, then they should go. For the opportunities out there, and unfortunately sometimes it depends on the community themselves and their allies to kind of write their own narrative, but I do think, unfortunately it is the tragic event of 9/11 which shaped that discourse and misrepresentation, and that is continuing. Unless we can make the examples that are in our society out there or more public. I mean, women are active in all levels of society, not dependent on their faith, and I think that's something that if we can make more public, like you said, I don't know if it's a conscious thing. I don't know if bad news just sells better, and that's what people are interested in sharing, and not sharing the good news in society. But hopefully with efforts, change can come. We have another question from Amelia Underwood King, who says, hello, thank you very much for such an informative discussion. I'm a young feminist working with school students in the UK to tackle gender inequality. So I was wondering if any of the panelists have any insights into how young women of faith can be more involved, and whether their position is unique compared to older women of faith. So I think the question is if there is an age dynamic there. So if anyone wants to go ahead with that question, John.
This is totally not my area of expertise. So as you said, my PhD was about British Orthodox Jewish women and their experiences of being women of faith in their local communities. So to some extent, I'm just thinking about how those women that I interviewed would be relevant to this question. I did interview women of different ages, but most of them were, I'm just thinking now, were certainly over 30. So I would presume at that point that that's what, I think it's Amelia, is it, would call older. Although I shudder at the thought. Yeah, so I think that obviously speaking to people who have experience of dealing with, she considers herself a feminist, so dealing with issues of how feminism works in terms of being a woman of faith, that is with the people in your own families, in your local communities, and perhaps with the theology in general. I imagine that would be incredibly beneficial for her to have conversations with older women who have either studied that, researched it, or have experience in having those conversations. So I would very much encourage her to, read literature on the issue written by women who are at this stage older, but to really feel comfortable approaching women in faith communities who themselves will have dealt with many of these issues. She says she's in education, so I think that finding a mentor, I imagine, is something that she has access to, I would hope. So I would very highly recommend that she finds a woman of faith to do that with, and I imagine, yes, that she would get a lot out of asking questions, having conversations, and learning from other people's experience.
I have a pessimistic view a little bit, especially given schools. A friend of mine recently told me that her son made a throwaway remark, and he was reported by his teacher to the preventing violent extremism authorities that are supposed to be like identifying and rooting out terrorism in British schools. And that just makes me think that just thinking about, for example, young Muslim women organizing, coming together, forming networks within schools actually probably is incredibly dangerous, risky, and probably best left sort of for outside sort of extracurricular activity, because being reported actually leaves a mark on your criminal record. I think there is an incredible load of bureaucracy, and it really can impact young people's lives. So for that particular group, it seems like things are not going that well. At least the British state is not facilitating free discussion and freedom of speech. In that regard, I imagine that young Muslim women coming together to discuss gender inequalities maybe in their communities, that's something that the British state might kind of facilitate or foster, and not hinder, at least. Whereas talking about things like Islamophobia, about racism, about sort of structural inequalities in education and labor markets, that could actually, if interpreted as extremist, it can have incredibly negative consequences for these young women's lives. So it is really, a mixed bag nowadays.
I'm just going to pick up on a different point. What Anna has just said has highlighted so clearly to me, my lack of experience in the communities that she's talking about, and the differentiation that I mentioned earlier about homogeneity and heterogeneity, assumptions that I might make about the Orthodox Jewish community as compared with a different community, not in the UK, not Orthodox, not Jewish. All of these things have their own textures and their own resonances. And I'm here on a panel talking about these things. And yet there was an insensitivity on my part to, like a different community in a different space, a different religion. And, not that I assumed that my remarks were for everybody in every space, but just what Anna has said highlights what we've been speaking about, which is this incredible richness on the positive side and variety of community, but also the different assumptions and biases and racism, actually, clear racism that some communities experience differently from others.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of comment on personal experience, when I was a student studying in secondary school in the UK, we wanted to set up a human rights kind of society or club in school. That was faced with a lot of caution by the teachers and staff. We did an assembly on it, the whole school assembly, close to 1,000 students, and we kind of presented our case. It was a huge sort of gathering, and it was, I was probably the only Muslim in my year, maybe even the school at the time, because it wasn't a very diverse school that I went to, and I felt that, and at the end, I don't know the kind of what happened in the background, but the head mistress who was behind us and supporting us, she was the one that said, maybe you should do an assembly to kind of put your case to the school and kind of have that support. It was a lot of complications, and then at some point she just asked me to visit her in the office, and she said that there are some people who are cautioned about what you're doing, they don't want you to do it, but I'm behind you. So it took her remarks as an individual, and she is of a different faith to me, and she's been a mentor, and I think the question kind of had that age element involved as well, and she's much older than me, but has been and of a different faith, but has been a successful kind of mentor to me, and has been advocating that I later went on to do debating work, and it was something that I saw as a student in a very white town, that I, with my headscarf, was involved in debating, and I was the one that everyone was looking at and everyone was kind of waiting, which reminds me of a previous question about it being a burden if I see myself as representation, but I was just child trying to kind of, I defined myself and had a lot of things going on, which I couldn't understand at the time. But looking back now, I can see that I did have a lot of pressure on me. But of course, what Anna said about, prevent and how people are more conscious now in public spaces, especially. But I do think there is some space and there is a kind of way of doing it. At the Dialogue Society, we have the life of a chickpea kind of presentation that we go in to schools, and it's on our Noah's pudding that we do, and we do assemblies in schools throughout the UK on kind of community and diversity and methods of integration. So if you were a chickpea, what would you like to be in? And we have 3 different options, a soup where everyone's mushed up into the same identity, or a salad where you need an outside kind of sauce or oil, or this pudding, which we call Noah's pudding, which is the representation of a pudding, which is believed to be by the prophet Noah, which is kind of a prophet or individual that is kind of seen in both the Jewish, Christian and Muslim traditions. So for that's kind of an inclusive way of kind of making a case and on the life of a chickpea. So perhaps we need to be more kind of creative about the ways that we're going by, and also doing it and planning, in line with education specialists as well. But I do think that the gap is there. There is an opportunity and there is a need in society for it. But hopefully with efforts, we can come closer to that. I'm just checking, we haven't, Councillor Rakhia hasn't been able to join us. And I'm just going to check to see if I have any further questions come through. Just checking. I don't think I have any questions. If our attendees or anyone watching on YouTube has any sort of questions, we can channel them through into our discussion. Or if panelists, Shuying or Hannah, if there's anything kind of you guys wanted to say specifically as well, we could have that in the discussion as well. Okay, I just got a message come through that, there are kind of societies, I think, for mature students of faiths to join in kind of universities, and that works as well. As kind of a comment that I've got through, but I think Amelia's question was more on children and engaging in perhaps primary or secondary school activities with children. Okay, we've got 5 more minutes left. I had a question that I prepared before we came together. I was wondering if I could put that question forward, and then hopefully we can end on this question. How open are people in your area of work to having conversations around discrimination towards people of different faith, or towards women in more generally? Are people more open to talk or hesitant to bring these issues up nowadays?
Okay, I'll jump in then. So the answer is it depends. I straddle different worlds. I'm here at the LSE as a researcher. I'm also, as a researcher, part of the Faith Centre community. So I'm both an academic, but I'm also part of the Faith Centre. And I have to say that my experience in the gender Department of Gender, and in this centre has also been just outstanding in terms of debate, discussion, acceptance, sensitivity, but also the feeling of being able to ask questions when things seemed odd or bizarre or whatever it is in my life, and ritual practice or something like that. So I have found it a very easy space in that regard. Having said that, when I first began life as a master's student at the Department of Gender, I didn't feel that. I felt that I was coming as kind of a married religious woman, a mother of 5, married to a man who was originally a rabbi, like that, all those assumptions presumptions about me would have been made. And I was wrong about that. But I came with those fears and anxieties on the one hand. So that's one space. In terms of two other spaces I'll mention, in terms of the local religious community with which I affiliate and associate and am a member of, we have membership to communities. I feel that is a harder space for me sometimes to be my full self. And I would say that is even harder in the larger umbrella of the Orthodox Jewish rabbinic authoritative community here in the UK, with whom I have had many, well, conversations is a polite description, but difficult conversations, conflicts, arguments about certain ritual practices or assumptions or exclusions. And I have not found it easy to, again, necessarily navigate the questions that I have in that broader community.
Speaking to the American context, again, it all depends. Like Lindsay said, you know, what's happening out there in the world and what the power structures are, and is the discrimination, racism, prejudice sort of aligned with the policy? As in, you know, are we generally supposed to, as an American society, are we supposed to let that go or not? And I mean, my personal gripe here is, you know, and I'm from Eastern Europe, so I love the Ukrainian people, and my heart is bleeding for what's happening with them during this Russian attack. And a lot of my neighbors have put out Ukrainian flags. They're sort of, you know, obviously, you know, against the Russian attack, and they're all moved by the news reports about, you know, the brutality, you know, the atrocity that are happening. So that's really clear. Like, you know, we're wanting to help Ukraine, even if we're not going to give military aid as such. But, you know, there's a very kind of pro-Ukrainian feel. And I'm just thinking back to last May when Israel was bombing Gaza and the West Bank, and nobody had their flags. Nobody put out the Ukrainian flag. The media was very quiet about it. You really had to go to Twitter or social media to find out what's going on there. And in my field, in my, you know, and I work in the field of Islam and gender. There was very little in the way of any sort of, you know, solidarity statement with the Palestinians. The main disciplinary association, American Academy of Religion, did not say anything. And so, you know, it was just individual people that some, you know, some of them did make statements about that, but sort of structure-wise, there was a resounding silence about what's going on in Palestine, even though, you know, two very kind of, you know, just from sort of, if you look at it from above, you know, two military powers bombing civilians and so on. So similar, right? But not similar. So it depends.
I mean, I think my comment would just be from personal experience as well. Being part of a Muslim community group here is kind of primarily in diaspora, so it's not primarily native. I mean, I would be part of second generation Turkish Muslim community, but predominantly it isn't native. It's there are a lot of kind of cultural norms which are emerging with religion, and there are a lot of ways that you're trying to kind of mediate things, and things that perhaps are my norms are not the other norms, and perhaps my norms don't have aren't against, you know, the religious narrative or prescription within Islam. but I'm seeing that there is a lot of change going on as well within my own community, and women are much more public and more vocal than they were perhaps 5 years ago, and I think that may be a global shift within generational identities of being Muslim and now being native in our kind of Western countries that we're born and raised and educated in, and maybe other faith traditions kind of share that similarity as well. But that's kind of all that I had to contribute. Hannah and Shuying, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to say on the question at all.
No, just thank you for really interesting answers, and yeah, just learning a lot listening.
I mean, we're kind of just over time, but it's sad that Councillor Rakhia was unable to be with us today. But hopefully, we've had a rich Q&A session and discussion, which is a lot of nice dialogue, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time, and we discussed some difficult content at times, but thank you for all of our panelists who have been here, discussing and engaging in discussion with us, and all those attendees, both through this platform and joining us on YouTube as well. So thank you very much, and hopefully we can see where the policy paper will take us after this. Thank you very much for your time, everyone.
Thank you, Iysha.
Thank you.
Thank you.